Okay, we're going to start talking about the brainstem structures with the reticular formation. So the reticular formation is a complex neural network, includes the reticular nuclei, their connections, and ascending and descending reticular pathways. It integrates sensory and cortical information. So a lot of just sort of getting all that information, sorting it out, and controlling what happens in the reticular formation. And when we talk about nuclei, nuclei are a collection of neurons that do a specific task, or it might be they release certain neurotransmitters or they do certain things, and the reticular formation is a collection of a bunch of those nuclei. So it regulates somatic motor activity and autonomic function and consciousness. So that's huge. The reticular formation does a lot. And it also functions in modulating nociceptive pain information. So we talked a little bit about the descending controls, and a lot of those come from the reticular formation. So we're going to talk a little bit about the neurotransmitters. And in the PowerPoint, I have the individual reticular nuclei that release the different neurotransmitters. I really don't I'm not going to expect you to know the names of all those individual nuclei, but it's just a good way to organize the information. I'm not going to test you on the names of those. But there are 4 of them. The ventral tegmental area, or the VTA, the pedunculopontine nucleus, or the PPN, the raphe nuclei, which we've talked about before, and the locus coeruleus and medial reticular area. So that's just a way of organizing the information. You're not going to be tested on those. But the VTA, what it does is it produces dopamine. So most of the neurons in the body, in the brain, that produce dopamine are located in the midbrain. And dopamine affects cerebral areas involved in decision making and motivation. The addiction of amphetamines and cocaine increases dopamine production. So way back in chapter 2 or whatever, I had that link to the mouse party, and it showed the effect of different drugs on the brain. And the certain drugs, it shows it increases the amount of dopamine in the brain. A lot of times it gives you a flood of dopamine. So the dopamine mimics sympathetic activity, causing increased heart rate and constriction of blood vessels, and it produces feelings of pleasure and reward. So if there is a drug that produces those feelings of pleasure and reward, that's how people get addicted to it, because so morphine is habit forming because it inhibits inhibitory inputs of the ventral tegmental area, which makes the dopamine. So a lot of the addictive drugs have an effect on dopamine because of that feeling of pleasure and reward. So kind of interesting stuff. The PPN, it produces acetylcholine. It's located in the lower midbrain. It influences movements through connections to several brain areas that include some of the basal ganglia nuclei, the limbic system, and reticular areas. In people with Parkinson's disease, they lose PPN neurons as well as those substantia nigra neurons, and that some people get what are called dopamine resistant signs. So the dopamine mimicking drugs, which are usually used to treat Parkinson's, don't affect these areas. So difficulty with gait initiation, postural instability, and sleep problems. So a lot of people, even though the dopamine mimicking drugs solve some of their motor issues, they don't solve some of these other issues. So it's kind of interesting. The raphe nuclei, they produce serotonin. Serotonin plays a major role in the onset of sleep, and it has major effects on mood. If you have low serotonin levels, you're going to be in a depressive mood. So the drug antidepressants, Prozac and Zoloft, inhibit the reuptake of serotonin, keeping it available in the synapse longer. So the serotonin also works as a neurotransmitter in some of the pain pathways. It inhibits the transmission of pain in the spinal interneurons. So these are these are the descending neuronal controls that we talked about in the anti-nociceptive model. So the raphe nuclei produce serotonin, which then go down and have that neuromodulating effect to inhibit pain transmission. Okay. The locus ceruleus and the medial reticular zone, they produce norepinephrine, which regulates autonomic functions, helps regulate consciousness, including awareness of self and surroundings, and it governs alertness, sleep, and attention. So sometimes you'll get people with dementia who they are not aware of their surroundings, and sometimes they're not aware of themselves, and so probably this is an area of the brain that might be affected by their dementia. And then they have what's called sundowning. The patients, after the sun goes down, they're awake and alert. Well, the neurotransmitter and neuromodulator that governs alertness and sleep and attention is messed up, and so that's going to change their sleep cycles. Kind of interesting. So one of the big areas of the reticular activating system is called the ascending reticular activating system, or they'll call it the ARAS. Reticular activating system, they'll call the RAS. And the ARAS it functions in consciousness. That's your awareness of self and surroundings. It governs alertness, sleep, and attention. And so that has a lot to do with the sleep cycle and the consciousness. So there's a lot going on in the reticular formation. So in the module, there's some interesting videos. The information about the neurotransmitters is listed, and that's really what I want you to know for the exam. There's a little bit about how each one functions in the brain, which is pretty interesting. You see that dopamine is functioning in the prefrontal cortex and in the forebrain and the amygdala, so that's that pleasure reward area. Kind of interesting. And then some of the other ones where they're functioning. So there's a lot going on with the neurotransmitters in the brain. So a lot of times the neurotransmitters that are released by the reticular activating system act as neuromodulators. Those are the slow acting ones that stick around longer. So when we're talking about the serotonin in the descending pain controls, excuse me, the serotonin in the descending pain controls, that is a neuromodulator that stays around in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord and inhibits that pain transmission. So that's kind of interesting. So there are some neat and short videos about the reticular activating system that are couched more in layman's terms, which is, it's sometimes looking at those gives you a way to get a grasp on it and understand it without being so technical about it. But one example that I've heard, which is a good one, I have a couple examples. One of them is when you get a new car, all of a sudden you notice in town that there are lots of that same car, and you never noticed that before. Well, your reticular activating system is sort of keyed in to get you to notice that difference, and so you notice it more. So that's that alertness and consciousness thing. Or if you had possibly an illness, your doctor was testing you for stuff, you didn't really have any symptoms that you noticed, maybe they noticed something on your blood test. As soon as they give you a diagnosis, all of a sudden you notice yourself having symptoms, because now suddenly you're aware of it, it's more in your consciousnness, and you're alerted to those symptoms. And that's sort of a reticular activating system function, which is kind of interesting. So the videos that are more in layman's terms, it's kind of a nice way to get a handle on what the RAS does, which is kind of nice. I like that. So The pons, medulla, and midbrain, and the cerebellum, which we talked about in chapter 11, we're just going to briefly talk about each one's function and briefly. So just kind of briefly function of each one. The pons processes motor information from the cerebral cortex and forwards the information to the cerebellum. So the word pons in Latin means bridge. So you can think of it as being a bridge from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. The pontine cranial nerve nuclei process sensory information from the face, and they control contraction of muscles involved in facial expression and eye movement and chewing. So the pons it's a bridge. It's passing information from the sensory part of the cranial nerves to the brain, and then the motor part to the cerebellum, and going out through the cranial nerves as well. So it's the pons it's a bridge. It's passing information. So the medulla, there are a couple of pictures in the book which they show cross sections, and it shows where the different cross sections are and the different nuclei. I mean, I do not in any way want you to memorize these, but the reason I put them in here is because I just wanted you to see the complexity of what's going on in the medulla. So there's a lot going on in there. There's tons of tracts passing through there, nuclei that are producing different neurotransmitters, and so the medulla is an area that has a lot of effect on our bodies. So that's really the main reason for putting these slides in here. I don't expect you to memorize them or anything like that, but they're just to give you an idea of the complexity of the medulla. And so what the medulla does is it helps again in controlling head and eye movement, so that's a big part of what the cranial nerves do, and coordinating swallowing, that's another cranial nerve function, and it helps regulate cardiovascular, respiratory, and visceral activity. Wow, cardiovascular and respiratory and visceral activity, that's important stuff. That's vital function type things. So if we have dysfunction of the medulla, that is a big problem, because that can, you know, your heart's not beating and your respiratory functions aren't working. That's a big problem. So I just basically want you to know that, what the functions of the medulla are. So the midbrain is the uppermost part of the brainstem. So you can think of it, it's at the top of the brainstem, it's in the middle of the brain, if that makes sense. It connects the diencephalon to the pons. So the diencephalon is all of the structures that end in thalamus. So the hypothalamus, the subthalamus, the thalamus itself. So all of the structures with thalamus in their name, that's called the diencephalon, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter. The midbrain contains the substantia nigra, which is part of the basal ganglia circuit. That's where another place where a lot of dopamine is made. Those are the cells, some of the cells that start to die off in Parkinson's. And it includes the periaqueductal gray area, the PAG, that's involved in pain suppression. So when we're talking about the brainstem, a lot of the pain suppression things we talked about in chapter 7 are happening in the brainstem. So that's a really important area for pain control. There's also a little, what's called the cerebral aqueduct, which is a small canal through the midbrain, and it joins the third and fourth ventricles of the cerebrospinal fluid system, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in chapter 19. But the midbrain is sort of a little conduit for that. So the cerebellum we talked about in chapter 11. Its function is entirely dependent on input and output connections with the brainstem. So the brainstem, the pons, they provide the connection to the cerebellum between the brain and the cerebral cortex. So the brainstem has a lot of importance for the cerebellum. And they share that tightly confined space of the posterior fossa of the cranium. So they're right there next to each other. So we've talked about this before, and of course it was on the last exam. It's not going to be on the next exam, but just to summarize, cerebellum coordinates movement, does motor planning, and it also coordinates cognitive functions, including rapid shifts of attention. So there's a lot going on in the cerebellum. So talking about disorders of the brainstem, because we have all the tracts going through the brainstem, a lot of times when they're evaluating tracts, it can allow them to localize lesions within the brainstem when they see what's going on in the individual tracts. So a single brainstem lesion can cause a mix of ipsilateral and contralateral lines because because the tracts cross over at different areas. So the cranial nerves, they supply the ipsilateral face and neck. A lot of the vertical tracts cross midline in the brainstem to supply the contralateral body. And so you can, if you have brainstem dysfunction, you can have effects on the ipsilateral side of the face and neck and the contralateral side of the body. So that's one of the ways that they localize it as being in the brainstem, is you have that mix of signs. So lesions in the brainstem can also interfere with vital functions like heart rate and breathing and consciousness. So very, very important area. If you have a lesion in the brainstem, you could be in a coma. And there's actually a chart in the book where it shows the different stages of coma, which I don't expect you to memorize, but the different altered states of consciousness. It's table 15-2, and it's on page 369. But they talk about, minimally conscious and vegetative state and coma, that sort of thing. And those are all affected by the brainstem. So if you're in that state, it might be because you have a brainstem lesion. Okay, so the lateral coracospinal, dorsal column, medial lemniscus, and spinothalamic tracts connect the spinal cord with the opposite side of the cerebrum, and they cross over in the medulla. The lesions of the lateral corticospinal and dorsal column tracts in the brainstem usually cause contralateral signs because the tracts cross the midline in the inferior medulla. So where that crosses over helps them localize the lesion, where the symptoms are. Kind of interesting. So there's several slides in the PowerPoint on different types of lesions, and I'm not really going to focus a lot on those. I'm not going to quiz you on them or expect you to know them really well. It's a little bit interesting, which is why I included them, but beyond that, just a level of interest, I'm not going to expect you to know those. So there's also a listing of what contralateral and ipsilateral signs you can expect to see. So a single lesion in the upper anteromedial medulla on the left side can cause paralysis of the right hand and foot because it crosses over, the motor tracts cross over. It can cause loss of discriminative touch and proprioceptive information on the right side of the body. That's the dorsal column effects, and they cross over there. And then paresis on the left side of the tongue because the cranial nerves come from that left side. So the lesions on the left side, you get paralysis and loss of dorsal column information on the right of the body, and you get paresis of the left side of the tongue because the cranial nerve is on that left side and the lesion's on the left side. So when you have a brainstem lesion that is causing disorders of your vital functions, it can cause your heart to stop beating, your blood pressure to be uncontrolled, to fluctuate out of control, or your breathing to cease. There are areas in the medulla and the pons that regulate vital functions, and if those are affected, you could die. So it's a very important area of the brain. So we'll talk about the 4 Ds of brainstem dysfunction. These I want you to memorize and know. So the cardinal signs of brainstem dysfunction are dysphagia, which is difficulty in swallowing, dysarthria, which is difficulty in speaking, diplopia, which is double vision, and dysmetria, which is the inability to control the distance of movements. For example, you're going to reach out and grab a coffee cup and you miss. Either you reach too far or you don't reach far enough. And so the inability to control the distance of your movement. So I want you to know those 4 Ds and that they are associated with brainstem region dysfunction. Okay, so there are a couple slides on the disorders of consciousness, and it has that table 15-2 with the states of altered consciousness. Because the reticular activating system is located in the brainstem, you can have brainstem disorders that affect your level of consciousness. You can be in a coma or a vegetative state because of a brainstem disorder. There is some information about tumors in the brainstem and brainstem region ischemia. Again, that is there just for information. I will not test you on that information. Okay? So that's all we're going to talk about with the brainstem. So basically, I want you to know the different areas of the brainstem and basically their function, just their basic function. Just the 4 Ds of brainstem dysfunction. Dysphagia, dysarthria, diplopia. Let me get the slide up so you can see it. Dysphagia, dysarthria, diplopia, and dysmetria. 4 Ds of brainstem dysfunction. Okay, that's what I want you to know. And each area and its basic function.